Hi, welcome to Prime Recap. After being given infinite power, a mediocre professor who dreams of being a successful writer enlists the help of his talking dog to save the planet. Today we will recap the story of the movie, Absolutely Anything, from 2015. In 1972, the Atlas Centaur rocket left Earth to take off into space and traverse the solar system with the mission of finding intelligent life somewhere in the vastness of the universe. Inside the spaceship is a drawing containing two human figures, a man and a woman, along with a map showing the location of the planet. Several years have passed since the rocket left orbit and writer Neil Clarke receives an award. The man has written a highly successful novel and is interviewed by Catherine. While answering some questions about his successful work, Neil hears his dog barking, and suddenly dozens of dogs invade the place. At that moment, the writer wakes up and realizes that it was all just a dream. He has just fallen asleep while writing a new chapter of his book and gets up when he hears the doorbell ring. When he opens the door, Fiona, his neighbor, orders him to make his dog stop barking, otherwise she will find a way to send him to a shelter. Neil then decides to take Dennis for a walk and meets Catherine. The woman lives downstairs and asks if Neil has finished writing his novel. The writer has been working on his novel for more than a year and has not yet managed to finish it, but he still believes that his work will be a success. While this is not happening, Neil works as a teacher to earn a living, together with his best friend and coworker, Ray. After a long journey through space, the Atlas Centaur rocket encounters an alien ship and the illustration sent by humans ends up in the hands of dark creatures. The drawing joins the rest of their collection and the aliens decide to investigate planet Earth to find out how humans live. Finding that the Earthlings' lifestyle is anything but decent, the court of the Intergalactic Council decides to destroy the planet. However, one of the members does not agree with this decision and states that the Earthlings should be given a chance to redeem themselves. In this way, humans will have the opportunity to prove that they deserve to take their place in space, otherwise they will be eliminated. After a bad day at work, in which she discovers that the company she works for is a big fraud, Catherine decides to stop by the market before going home. The woman cries while holding a jar of pickles and Neil, realizing what is happening, tries to console her. The teacher takes some tissues from the market and hands them to his neighbor, who just ignores him and leaves. Following the Intergalactic Handbook, the council members randomly choose a human who is to inherit the power of the higher beings, which will allow him to do absolutely anything. In this way, the selected Earthling will be able to prove that his species is capable of distinguishing between good and evil. During processing, Neil ends up being drawn to receive the powers and gains the gift shortly after being knocked off his bicycle. Meanwhile, Catherine is in a coffee shop complaining to her friend about Grant, her possessive and obsessive ex-boyfriend. Rosie then asks why Catherine won't give her neighbor a chance, and the woman says that Neil is very considerate, but not her type. When he arrives at work, Neil gets a scolding from the director. The man says it is the second time he has been late that week and says he can't take his excuses anymore. After calling him incompetent, the principal says that if he could, he would certainly replace him. Before entering the classroom, Neil glances through the door and is disheartened to see his unruly students making a mess, so he decides to read the newspaper about horse racing instead of teaching. During the break, Ray invites Dorothy to a dinner party, but the woman ignores him completely. During lunch, Ray asks his friend what he would do if he could do anything, and Neil replies that he would make an alien ship destroy his class. Suddenly, they hear a frightening noise and Neil runs to see what has happened. Just then, he discovers that the school has suffered an attack and only the students in his class have been wiped out. Devastated by what has happened, the professor returns home to find Dennis' waste scattered all over the floor of his apartment. Neil tells his dog what happened and tries to convince himself that it was not his fault at all. He says that if he could make an alien ship destroy his class, he could also make Dennis' waste go in the toilet by himself. As he says this, his wish comes true, and the waste goes directly into the toilet. After jumping into the toilet, the flush is activated automatically. Neil becomes desperate and looks in his cupboard for a drink. After a few sips of whiskey, he manages to calm down and accidentally spills the liquid into the sink. To make sure he is not going crazy, the man orders the whiskey back into the bottle and discovers that all he has to do is make a request while moving his hands for it to come true. Soon after, Neil orders the drink to be switched to another brand of whiskey and the bottle goes skipping down the stairs. The professor then goes after it in an attempt to retrieve it, and ends up following the object to the nearest convenience store. At that instant, the bottle breaks the glass and breaks into the establishment, causing the security alarm to be activated. While on the run, Neil is captured by a policeman, but Dennis helps him escape. The pair hides in a thicket, but the man is found again by the cops and uses his powers to be transported back home with his dog. When he gets home, he remembers what happened to his class and realizes that it was all his fault. In an attempt to make things right, He uses his powers to bring everyone who has died back to life, causing a zombie attack on the world. When he realizes that the streets are packed with the undead, the man undoes his order and orders that the explosion that eliminated his students never happened. At this time, he returns to his lunch hour, minutes before the alien attack happens, and Ray states that if he could do anything, he would make Professor Dorothy love him. While at work, while listening to a lesson from her boss, Catherine spots her ex-boyfriend on the other side of the door. The woman then goes to him to ask the reason for his visit and orders him to leave. Colonel Grant insists on winning her back, and Catherine says that she no longer has feelings for him. When he realizes what is happening, James shows up and throws the man out. Before leaving, Grant says goodbye to his ex and that they will talk again soon. When Neil arrives at school the next morning, he realizes that nothing has changed. His students are still unruly and uninterested in class, so he uses his powers to transform them into young people interested and eager to learn. In between, Neil runs into the director and manages to get the man who hates him the most to be kind and friendly enough to praise him for his lousy job. Seeing his friend exhaustively trying to win Dorothy's attention, Neil takes pity on him and makes the woman love Ray. Later, while walking through the streets, Neil spots some pictures of the White House and orders him to become the newest president of the United States. Apparently, his life remains the same, until some men in suits approach and pull Neil into the vehicle in order to save him from a gunfight. During their escape, they get into an accident and crash into a truck. Luckily, Neil manages to get out of this alive and undoes his order. That same evening, in his house, the professor wants to see Catherine, the neighbor who lives in the apartment below, and the floor of his room disappears. Upon realizing what has happened, the woman begins to scream and Neil must get her to forget the incident. He can no longer keep this secret to himself and decides to tell Ray about his powers. Upon entering the lab, Neil says he can do anything, and to prove his claim, he makes the skeleton used in science classes start talking. He then orders it to jump out the window, falling into the arms of the director. Still, Ray refuses to believe in his friend's mystical powers. Convinced that it was all just a big trick, he challenges him to make the whole room covered with flowers, and Neil grants his request. Ray is still not very convinced, but everything changes when the director opens the door with the skeleton in his hands and is extremely polite when talking to Neil. Upon discovering the truth, Ray's first idea is to use his friend's powers to win horse racing bets. However, when they realize that they can win all bets, the pair give up racing and look for other ways to use that power. That day, as Catherine is leaving work, she is surprised by Grant's sudden appearance. The colonel informs her that he has rented a luxury apartment for them to spend the weekend and hands the keys to his ex, even though she says she will not spend the weekend with him. Furious, Catherine calls Rosie to her apartment that night. This way, she can vent about her disappointing job and her obsessive ex-boyfriend. Rosie then suggests that her friend spend the night with Neil to forget her troubles for a while, and Catherine begins to think about this possibility. In space, the Intergalactic Council experiences some unforeseen events and must suspend the powers they have ceded to the Earthling until they can resolve the glitch in the system. It is dawn when Neil wakes up and uses his powers to make Catherine fall in love with him. Just then, the doorbell rings and his neighbor throws herself into his arms. What neither of them could imagine is that Grant is watching from outside the building. A few minutes later, the aliens fix the magic hourglass and give Neil back his intergalactic powers. When he wakes up, he sees a note left by Catherine, by which the woman informs him that she has gone to get ready for work. Happy that his powers have worked, Neil gets up on that rainy morning and makes sure that the city is graced by sunshine. Then he puts on his clothes to go and eat his breakfast. Upon arriving in his classroom, Ray spots the shrine that Dorothy has built for him and realizes that the teacher has caused the students to become her worshippers as well. Meanwhile, Neil is at home reading his book and Dennis starts barking incessantly. The man then uses his powers to turn his dog into a rational being capable of speech. After giving him some cookies, the two start talking and Neil asks Dennis for love advice. Just then, the doorbell rings and Neil orders the dog to be quiet so as not to cause trouble. When he opens the door, Catherine enters and tries to explain herself about what happened the night before. The woman claims to like Neil and reveals that she would like the two of them to continue meeting, but is interrupted by Dennis, who begins shouting from the kitchen. Then Catherine comes to the conclusion that her neighbor actually does not like women and was trying to hide the truth. Furious, the woman leaves and Neil decides to go after her to explain himself. He teleports into the bus where Catherine is and ends up getting stuck in the vehicle's engine. By the time he manages to join the passengers, his neighbor is already outside and Neil runs to try to catch up with her. However, Ray shows up and asks his friend to undo the charm he has cast on Dorothy. The woman has managed to convince other people that her coworker is a deity and is pursuing him everywhere. However, Neil is in a hurry to talk to Catherine and turns Ray into a sausage so as not to be disturbed. Just then, Dorothy and her demented followers appear and start gazing at Ray's car. Meanwhile, Neil enters the cafeteria where Catherine is and tries to explain that Dennis is just his dog. At this time, the attendant spots the sausage in his hands and makes him pay for it, even though Neil says he was already holding the food before he even entered the store. After being attacked, the man decides to pay for the sausage and gets his friend back to normal. Upon seeing Ray, Dorothy and her group go after him again, and the Intergalactic Council realizes that they made a big mistake by delivering all that power into the hands of a demented man. Hours later, when Catherine arrives home, she is surprised by Grant. Realizing that the man has broken into her house, the woman locks the door and Neil invites her to hide in his house. Immediately, he rushes to prepare the food and orders Dennis to pretend to be a normal dog for the next few hours. During dinner, the man tries to explain to Catherine about his powers and reveals that Dennis, the guy she heard that morning, is actually his dog. Upon hearing this, the woman comes to believe that her neighbor is suffering from a psychological outbreak and says she is willing to help him. However, the couple receives an unexpected visit from Colonel Grant, who breaks into the apartment and points a gun at Neil. With his powers, the professor manages to disarm him and the two begin to exchange a few punches. After getting rid of the pistol, Catherine walks away and leaves those two to sort themselves out. After breaking free from Grant's clutches, Neil uses his powers for revenge and gets him trapped in the ceiling. The man then falls headlong into the potted plant and cannot get up. To tease him further, Neil makes $1 million appear in his hands and then disappears with the money. In an attempt to intimidate his opponent, Neil reveals that he can do anything, just say what he wants to happen and then move his hand. However, after this, Neil is distracted by talking to Dennis, so Grant takes the opportunity to attack him and breaks the plant pot on his head. When he wakes up, the professor is bound and gagged. He and his dog have been taken elsewhere, and the general orders Neil, when he removes his gag, to read exactly what is written on the paper, otherwise Dennis will be eliminated. The first item on Grant's list is for all Englishmen to have big ears and duck feet. After waving his hand, Neil makes this wish come true. After work, Catherine rushes back to Neil's house and is concerned when she sees the broken vase on the floor. Upon searching the place, she finds Ray hiding in the closet and the man explains that he is hiding from his fanatical worshippers. After Neil used his powers to get Dorothy to worship her coworker, the woman began to follow him around as if Ray was her savior and became convinced that he is immortal. Now she and the other fanatics want to prove this theory. Worried about Neil, Catherine takes the keys to the apartment Grant has rented for the weekend, because she believes her ex-boyfriend is there. As they leave the building, they are chased by Ray's worshippers and must run to avoid being caught. Minutes later, the pair make it to the condo and take the elevator up to the apartment where Grant is staying. When he hears his ex's voice, the colonel orders Neil to jump to the last item and make Catherine fall hopelessly in love with him. The instant the woman jumps on top of Grant, Neil takes the opportunity to free Dennis and transform his enemy into a corgi. It then causes Catherine to return to normal and all of the colonel's wishes to be cancelled. Soon after, Dorothy and her group appear and attack Ray. To save his friend, Neil removes the charm he cast on the woman and makes her hate him again. After all the worshippers leave, Catherine asks Ray to take her home and does not accept Neil's apologies. Days go by and he is still trying to find an opportunity to talk to his neighbor. Neil confesses that he believed he had made Catherine fall in love with him, but only now realizes that what they experienced was totally real, without any interference from his powers. Upon hearing this, the woman begins to question her entire life, believing that Neil has always been trying to control her. Catherine claims that she could never fall in love with a man who forces her to do whatever he wants, without allowing her to have a will of her own. After being dumped, Neil goes to talk to Dennis and tells him that even Ray doesn't want to talk to him after all that has happened. Feeling guilty for having used his powers only to fulfill selfish desires, the professor decides to start using them for good. In order to end world hunger, he makes sure that everyone has as much food as they want on their tables, and that nations no longer have any reason to declare war on each other. Finally, Neil wants global warming to be reversed. He then turns on the TV to check if his wishes have come true and realizes that he has only succeeded in making people's lives even worse. Due to overeating, the average weight of China's inhabitants rose to 150 kilos, and nations started to declare war on each other for no reason. Now the whole world is in danger. With the end of global warming, the planet was covered with snow, just as it was 500 million years ago during the Ice Age. Realizing that his attempt to improve the world has been a great failure, Neil undoes all his claims and decides to take his own life. However, after he jumps off the bridge, Dennis goes after his guardian with the intention of saving him, and Neil is the one who ends up having to prevent the dog from drowning. Inside their spaceship, the members of the Intergalactic Council try to reach a verdict and decide the fate of the Earth. Despite having done several bad things with his powers, Neil has managed to fix almost all of his mistakes, so the aliens find it difficult to come to an agreement. After much pondering, they decide to eliminate the human species and begin preparing the destruction generator. In order to win back Catherine's heart, Neil decides to give up his powers and hand them over to Dennis, because he knows that his dog will use his abilities to do whatever he commands. Now that he is in possession of the ultimate power, Dennis decides to use it to destroy the source of that magic forever. In this way, without even knowing it, the dog destroys the alien ship that was about to eliminate Earth and saves all the inhabitants of the planet. The next day, Neil falls asleep again while writing his book and wakes up to Fiona ringing the doorbell. After giving his annoying neighbor a kiss, he rushes to tell Catherine that he has rid himself of his powers and invites her to dinner. The woman then accepts the invitation, and Grant is forced to watch his ex-girlfriend go out with the guy who turned him into a corgi. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, please like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.